Picture a building that has just collapsed, concrete slabs stacked at impossible angles, rebar twisted through what used to be a stairwell, dust still hanging in the air where the light hasn't reached in hours. Somewhere underneath all of it, there might be a survivor. No robot built by human hands can fit through the gaps that matter. No dog can climb through a void 4 centimeters wide. But something else can. A cockroach carrying a microphone the size of a grain of rice, guided not by its own instincts, but by a soldier standing 200 meters away with a tablet in his hands. The roach doesn't know it's on a mission. It only knows that an electrical pulse just told its brain to turn left, and its legs obeyed, because that is what 65 million years of evolution built a cockroach's nervous system to do without question. This is not science fiction. This is a real program funded by the United States military, and it has existed for almost 2 decades. In 2006, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA, quietly opened a new research initiative with a name few people outside the Pentagon would ever hear, the Hybrid Insect Microelectromechanical Systems Program, or HIMEMS. The premise, stripped of the acronyms, was almost absurdly simple. Building a robot the size of an insect that can fly, walk, climb, and survive on almost no power is one of the hardest engineering problems in existence. Insects had already solved that problem through millions of years of evolution for free. So instead of trying to out-engineer nature, DARPA decided to hijack it. The man who ran the program, a physicist named Amit Lal, explained the thinking in terms that sounded almost like a historical argument. Humanity has used animals as tools for war and labor for thousands of years, he said. Horses carried cavalry, elephants pulled siege equipment. Bees have even been trained to detect the chemical signature of landmines. HIMEMS, in his framing, was simply the next chapter of that same relationship, updated for the electronic age. Instead of saddles and reins, this program would use microchips and electrodes. Instead of training an animal's behavior over months, it would bypass behavior entirely and control the nervous system directly. The engineering challenge was not attaching a chip to a fully grown insect. That had already been tried, decades earlier, with unreliable and often fatal results, because a fully developed insect's tissue does not adapt well to something bolted onto it after the fact. Early experiments in the 1990s and early 2000s had managed to control the walking direction of cockroaches and even lab rats, but only through what researchers themselves described as invasive surgery, the kind that left the animal too damaged to survive outside a laboratory for long. A cyborg that could only function under a microscope in a sealed room was never going to be useful in a collapsed building or a cave in a war zone. DARPA needed something that could walk out the other side of the process alive, functional, and durable enough to actually be deployed. The insight that made HIMEMS different was timing. DARPA-funded researchers began implanting microelectromechanical systems into insects during the pupal stage, the point in an insect's life cycle where its entire body is still being rebuilt, from the inside, cell by cell, on its way to becoming an adult. Inside a pupal case, an insect essentially dissolves large portions of its own larval body into a kind of biological soup, then reassembles that material into the legs, wings, and organs of the adult form. It is one of the only points in the natural world where an organism's tissue is malleable enough to grow directly around a foreign object, without triggering the kind of rejection or scarring that would doom the same procedure performed on a fully grown adult. If a chip and a set of electrodes were placed inside the insect at that exact moment, the growing tissue would form around the hardware naturally, the same way skin grows around a splinter, except in this case, the splinter came with a data port. What emerged from the pupal case afterward was not an insect with something attached to it. It was, in the truest technical sense, part machine, before it had ever taken its first breath as an adult. The mechanism that let a human operator actually steer the finished cyborg exploited something every cockroach is born with, a hardwired escape reflex. In nature, when something brushes against a cockroach's antenna in the dark, the insect doesn't stop to think. It turns sharply away from whatever touched it and runs, a survival reflex fine-tuned over hundreds of millions of years to react faster than conscious thought ever could. HIMEMS-derived systems learn to mimic that exact sensation electronically. A pulse sent to the electrode on the left antenna convinced the roach's nervous system that something had just touched it on the left side, and the insect turned right to escape it, precisely on command, without ever knowing there had been no real touch at all. The animal was not being taught. It was being tricked by its own oldest instincts, over and over, into becoming a vehicle. By 2009, DARPA had invested $12 million into the program, and it had spread across some of the most respected engineering departments in the country. At Texas A&M University, researchers worked with cockroaches, exploiting the same escape reflex that makes a roach dart to one side the instant something brushes its antenna. At the University of Michigan and the University of California, Berkeley, separate teams worked with beetles, embedding electrodes directly into the flight muscles so a beetle in mid-flight could be steered right or left with a small electrical pulse. A team led by researchers connected to MIT worked with moths, exploiting their nervous systems during the pupal stage before the moth had ever flown a single meter under its own free will. Each of these programs was solving the same problem from a slightly different biological angle, all converging on the same goal: an insect that a human being, sitting somewhere else entirely, could steer like a remote-controlled vehicle, except one that never needed to be charged, could regenerate minor damage on its own, and could fit through gaps no drone ever could. The military applications were never subtle about their ambition. DARPA's own documentation described a goal of guiding a cyborg insect within 5 meters of a specific target using GPS or radio signals, then using onboard sensors to gather information a human being could never safely collect. A cyborg insect equipped with a chemical sensor could crawl into a cave or a shipping container and detect the presence of explosives without a single soldier ever entering that space. One equipped with a microphone could sit motionless in the corner of a room and record a conversation no listening device could have reached. One equipped with a camera could climb through rubble that swallowed search and rescue dogs and beam back video of survivors trapped beneath a collapsed building, all while looking to anyone watching like nothing more than an insect going about its business. For years, HIMEMS stayed almost entirely inside classified budgets and academic journals, the kind of program that surfaces occasionally in a defense trade publication and then disappears again from public conversation. That changed in 2013, when 2 neuroscientists in Michigan, Greg Gage and Tim Marzullo, took the underlying science and did something the Pentagon never intended. They sold it to the public. Their company, Backyard Brains, launched a Kickstarter campaign for a product called Robo-Roach, marketed with a tagline that left nothing to the imagination: the world's first commercially available cyborg. For $99, a customer received a small electronic backpack, a set of implantable electrodes, and step-by-step instructions for performing minor surgery on a live cockroach at their own kitchen table. The process involved chilling the insect in ice water until it stopped moving, sanding a small patch of its exoskeleton, gluing the backpack directly onto its shell, and threading a grounding wire into its thorax before inserting electrodes into its antennae. Once assembled, anyone with a smartphone could steer the roach left and right using Bluetooth signals, watching it twitch and scuttle in whatever direction the electrical pulse commanded, the exact same underlying mechanism DARPA had funded for military reconnaissance, now sitting on a middle school science fair table. The backlash arrived almost immediately. PETA filed a formal complaint with Michigan's Attorney General, arguing that Robo-Roach amounted to unlicensed veterinary surgery performed by untrained children, and calling the entire concept, in the organization's own words, retrogressive and morally dubious. Bioethicists weighed in publicly, one comparing the practice to something out of a work of fiction where living creatures are stripped of their own will and turned into puppets. Backyard Brains never denied what the product did. Their public position was that the educational value of hands-on neuroscience outweighed the ethical discomfort, and that the cockroaches used were a species people would otherwise kill on sight in their own homes without a second thought. One of the company's co-founders pointed out, somewhat pointedly, that they were not breaking a single law, and that the same insects being surgically altered for classroom demonstrations were routinely exterminated by the thousands with no ethical debate attached whatsoever. Neither side fully backed down. The company kept selling the kits. The controversy kept resurfacing every time a journalist rediscovered the product around the holidays, when it would occasionally show up on gift guides for the scientifically curious, sitting incongruously next to telescopes and chemistry sets. What made the robo-roach controversy genuinely uncomfortable, even for people who felt nothing at all about the fate of a single cockroach, was the underlying question it forced into the open. If society was willing to accept a hobbyist kit that turned a living nervous system into a remote-controlled toy, on the grounds that the animal in question was disposable, what exactly was the ethical line, and where had it actually been drawn? Nobody, in over a decade of debate, ever produced a fully satisfying answer. What almost nobody outside a small circle of neuroscientists and defense researchers understood, while the robo-roach story played out in headlines about ethics and children performing kitchen table surgery, was that the exact same core technology was quietly maturing inside far more serious institutions, aimed at far more serious problems. Search and rescue applications, largely theoretical when HIMEMS launched in 2006, have since moved into active field development. Researchers at North Carolina State University spent years refining what they call biobots, cyborg cockroaches carrying microphones capable of detecting the specific acoustic signature of a human voice buried under rubble. In simulated disaster scenarios, teams of these biobots have been released into piles of debris designed to mimic a collapsed building, tasked with locating a hidden sound source and relaying its position back to a control unit, all without a single human being needing to set foot inside a structure that might still be unstable enough to kill them. The appeal of using an actual living insect instead of a miniature robot comes down to a problem robotics still hasn't solved. A mechanical insect-sized robot needs a battery, and batteries small enough to fit inside a robot the size of a cockroach do not hold nearly enough power to be useful for more than a few minutes of movement. A living cyborg insect, by contrast, still eats, still metabolizes its own food into energy, and still walks, climbs, and squeezes through debris using muscles that took nature millions of years to perfect, and that no engineering team has ever been able to fully replicate in miniature. The insect provides the chassis, the legs, and the power source. The electronics only provide the steering wheel. As recently as 2025, researchers in Queensland, Australia, adapted the same underlying cyborg insect principle for an entirely different high-risk environment, underground mining. Darkling beetles, selected specifically for their strength and climbing ability relative to their size, were fitted with the modern descendants of the same electrode systems DARPA pioneered nearly 2 decades earlier. Designed to navigate collapsed mine shafts where sending a human being first could cost a life. Unlike the earlier DARPA-funded work, which focused heavily on aerial surveillance using flying beetles and moths, the Queensland project prioritized a beetle known specifically for its ability to climb over unstable rubble while carrying real weight. A detail that signals just how far the underlying research has shifted from abstract battlefield reconnaissance toward practical immediate rescue applications, nearly 20 years after the first pupa was implanted in a DARPA-funded lab. What began as a strange Pentagon research line item in 2006 has quietly become a live thread running through disaster response, defense reconnaissance, and consumer neuroscience education all at once. And it has never fully resolved the question it raised the moment the first electrode was implanted into the first insect pupa. A cockroach does not consent. It cannot refuse the command sent to its nervous system, cannot choose to walk toward danger instead of away from it, cannot understand that the turn it just made was not its own decision. Whether that matters when the insect in question is a cockroach most people would kill without a second thought, is a question the researchers who built this technology have spent 2 decades answering differently, depending on who's asking. And it is a question that gets harder, not easier, every time the same principle gets applied to a beetle, a moth, or whatever species proves useful next. There is something quietly unsettling about how ordinary this technology has become in under 20 years. What started as a classified line item inside a defense research budget is now, depending on which version of it you encounter, a search and rescue tool being tested for real collapsed buildings, a mining safety system operating underground in Australia, and a $99 box sitting on a shelf that any curious teenager can order without a background check or a license of any kind. The distance between a Pentagon laboratory and a kitchen table turned out to be far shorter than anyone at DARPA likely expected back in 2006, and that gap has never fully closed since. Somewhere right now, in a lab that most people will never hear about, a pupa is finishing its transformation with a microchip already grown into its body, waiting for the exact moment it emerges as an adult to find out, for the first time, that its next move was never entirely its own.